The most powerful man on earth started every single day by imagining the worst things people could do to him. And it's the reason nobody could ever hurt him. The tent is cold. Outside, the Danube is frozen solid enough to walk across, and somewhere past it, tribes are waiting who do not care that the man inside this tent rules more land than any human being in the history of the world. He is awake before the trumpets. He is awake before the guards change. He sits on the edge of a simple cot, a wax tablet on his knee, and he does something that would look, to anyone watching, like nothing at all. He talks to himself. Not out loud. Not madness. A private rehearsal, the same one he performs almost every morning of his adult life, in a tent on a frozen riverbank at the edge of the empire, in a palace in Rome, in the back of a war camp surrounded by the dying. And this morning, like most mornings, he says something to himself so simple it sounds almost like a joke. You are about to meet people today who will lie to you. Who will flatter you to your face and undermine you the moment you turn. Who will take credit for what you built and blame you for what they broke. He is not guessing. He has met these people before. He will meet them again tomorrow, and the day after that, for the rest of his life. And here is the strange part, the part that took me a long time to understand. He is not saying this to protect himself from them. He is saying it so that when they show up, he already knows what to do with his own face. This is not a story about willpower. This is not a story about positive thinking. This is not a story about a man who simply never got angry. This is a story about a habit performed alone, in the dark, before anyone was watching, a private ritual so ordinary that historians almost missed it, and so effective that it may be the single biggest reason his name is still spoken 2,000 years after his death. His name was Marcus Aurelius. And one particular morning, a morning we will come back to before this video is over, that quiet rehearsal in the dark was about to be tested for real. Not against a stranger. Not against a senator he barely knew. Against a man he had trusted with his own army. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Stay with me, because to understand what happened that morning, you first have to understand what this ritual actually was, and why almost everyone who has ever heard of it has gotten it slightly wrong. Here's what most people miss about that morning ritual. They hear, expect the worst from everyone, and they assume Marcus Aurelius was training himself to be cynical. Bitter. Guarded. The opposite is true, and once you see why, you cannot unsee it. The philosophers who came before him had a name for what he was doing. They called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Not predicting disaster to feel afraid of it. Rehearsing it, on purpose, in a safe and quiet moment, so that the real thing, when it finally arrives, finds you already standing. Think about the last time something blindsided you. A phone call you didn't see coming. A person who turned on you when you least expected it. Do you remember that specific feeling, not just the hurt, but the shock underneath the hurt? That double blow, where you're hit once by the event and a second time by your own surprise that it happened at all. Marcus was trying to remove the second hit. Not the pain. The shock. And he did not invent this habit out of nowhere. He was taught it, deliberately, and young. There was a tutor named Junius Rusticus, a serious, unglamorous man who introduced a teenage Marcus to the writings of a philosopher named Epictetus, a former slave who had every reason in the world to be bitter and instead became one of the calmest minds in the ancient world. Rusticus did not hand Marcus comfortable ideas. He handed him practice. Rehearsal. Discipline you repeat until it becomes instinct, the same way a soldier drills a maneuver so many times that his body knows what to do before his mind has time to panic. You can imagine what that must have felt like for a boy who would one day inherit the entire Roman world. Lonely, in a way. Almost unfair. While other young nobles were being taught how to charm a room, Marcus was being taught how to survive being disappointed by the people in it. But it gets stranger. Because Marcus did not get to practice this discipline in peace, in a quiet study, with plenty of time to think. He practiced it while running an empire that never stopped demanding things from him. Petitions arrived by the hundreds. Senators wanted his time. Generals wanted his approval. Family wanted his attention. Somewhere in that same palace, there was always a voice asking him for one more decision, one more signature, one more piece of himself. You know this feeling, even if your empire is much smaller than his. The version of it where everyone around you seems to need something, and there is no line, no door, no moment in the day where the requests simply stop. Here's the part nobody tells you about Marcus Aurelius: he was tired. Genuinely, humanly tired. He wrote, in one of his most quietly devastating lines, about waking up and not wanting to get out of bed, about telling himself that he was made for something more than warmth and blankets, and getting up anyway. Not because it was easy. Because it was necessary. That is not the image most people have of him. Most people picture a marble statue. Calm. Untouchable. Above it all. He was not above it. He was in it, every single day, the same as you. And that is exactly why the ritual mattered. It was not a luxury for a man with nothing to worry about. It was survival equipment for a man with everything to worry about. Here is the first turn, the part that starts to explain why this actually worked. When Marcus rehearsed meeting difficult people that morning, something changed in how his mind handled the day that followed. The betrayal, when it came, was not a surprise anymore. It was confirmation. He had already decided, hours earlier, exactly how he intended to respond to people behaving badly, calmly, without hatred, without letting their behavior dictate his own. So when the actual moment arrived, there was no scramble. No frantic search for the right reaction. The decision had already been made in the quiet, and the difficult moment simply had to walk into a room where the response was already waiting for it. Pay attention to this, because it is the entire mechanism in one sentence. Marcus prepared his expectations so thoroughly that reality could never catch him unprepared. That is not pessimism. Pessimism expects the worst and dreads it. Marcus expected the worst and simply planned around it, the way you check the weather forecast before a long drive. Not to ruin the trip. To pack the right coat. And there's one more thing worth sitting with before we move forward. This ritual was private. He was not performing calm for an audience. There was no one in that tent to impress. He was doing this work in the dark, for an audience of one, which tells you everything about whether it was real. The world would eventually see the results of these mornings. But the mornings themselves belonged to no one but him. So let's pause here for a second, because it's worth naming exactly what we've covered so far. This ritual was not about expecting the worst so you can dread it. It was about expecting the worst so you can meet it without flinching. Rehearsal, not resignation. And Marcus didn't come by this naturally, he was trained into it, young, by a tutor who cared more about his character than his comfort. If this is landing for you, if you've ever wished you could feel less blindsided by people, hit subscribe, because we're about to watch this exact habit get tested against something far bigger than a rude senator. A plague. And a betrayal from someone Marcus trusted with his own army. Drop a comment with one word, ready, if you're ready to see what this ritual actually cost him to practice. Now watch what happens next, because this is where the ritual stops being a nice morning habit and starts being the only thing standing between one man and total collapse. Somewhere around the year 165, soldiers returning from campaign in the east brought something back with them that no sword could fight. A plague. Historians still argue over exactly what it was, likely smallpox, or something close to it, but they don't argue about what it did. It moved through the empire like fire through dry grass. Rome itself lost so many people that carts had to move bodies out of the city because there weren't enough hands left to bury them properly. This was not a distant tragedy Marcus read about in a report. This was his empire, dying, city by city, while he was expected to keep governing as if the world still made sense. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing not long after these events, described a reign under enormous strain, plague at home, war on the frontier, and an emperor who somehow kept functioning through both at once. Dio was not a philosopher trying to make Marcus look good. He was a historian, describing what he saw. And what he saw was a man who did not fall apart, at a moment when falling apart would have been completely understandable. Here's what most people miss about that period of Marcus's life: the calm you read about in his private notebook was not written during peacetime, in some comfortable villa with time to spare. Much of it was written in exactly this stretch: plague behind him, war in front of him, grief on every side of him. The philosophy was not a hobby he practiced when life was easy. It was the only tool he had left when life stopped being easy at all. There's a Greek word the Stoics used for the kind of attention this required, and it's worth sitting with for a moment: prosoke. It means something like sustained, moment-to-moment awareness, not zoning out, not going numb, but staying fully present to what is actually happening, without letting panic or despair hijack the moment. Imagine trying to hold that kind of attention while your empire is losing people faster than it can bury them. That is what Marcus was training for, every single morning, in that quiet rehearsal before dawn. And this brings us to the word almost everyone gets wrong when they talk about Stoicism, including, frankly, a lot of people making videos about it. Apatheia. It sounds like our word apathy, and so people assume it means not caring. Numbness. Shutting down. That is not what it meant to Marcus or the philosophers he studied. Apatheia meant freedom from being controlled by destructive passion, not the absence of feeling, but the absence of being ruled by feeling. Marcus grieved. Marcus felt the weight of the plague, the exhaustion of endless war, the sting of disloyalty. He was not a stone. He simply refused to let those feelings drive the decisions that needed a clear head instead. This is the part that changes how the whole ritual looks. He was not training himself to stop caring about people. He was training himself to keep caring about people without letting their worst behavior, or the world's worst moments, decide who he became. Hold that thought, because it matters for what comes next. Because everything you've heard so far, the plague, the grief, the discipline, all of it was still, in a strange way, the easier version of the test. Managing a crisis is hard. But managing a crisis is not the same as being betrayed by someone who was supposed to be standing beside you through it. And that is exactly what happened next. Here's the part nobody tells you. The year is 175. Marcus is far from Rome, deep into a war that has already taken years longer than anyone wanted, camped somewhere along the Danube frontier, still recovering from an illness that had swept through the camp along with everyone else. And somewhere in the east, a rumor starts to spread. Not a small rumor. The worst one possible. The rumor says Marcus Aurelius is dead. A general named Avidius Cassius, a man Marcus had trusted enough to hand him command of the entire eastern half of the empire, hears this rumor and does not wait to confirm it. He declares himself emperor. Soldiers under his command salute him as their new ruler. Cities in the east begin, cautiously, to accept him. And somewhere, quietly, there are whispers that Marcus's own wife, Faustina, may have encouraged the whole thing, afraid of what would happen to her and her children if Marcus's illness had actually been fatal and a stranger inherited the throne instead of someone loyal to her family. Now picture receiving that news. Not as an abstract historical fact, but as the actual moment it must have arrived, a messenger, out of breath, standing in front of you with the kind of news that ends careers and starts civil wars. A man you promoted. A man you trusted with an army. Declaring, based on a lie, that your life is already over and your throne is his. You know this feeling on a smaller scale, even if nothing you've faced comes close to an empire splitting in two. The moment you learn someone you trusted was never as loyal as you believed. The specific, sickening drop in your stomach when betrayal arrives from a direction you never thought to guard. This is the exact moment that quiet morning ritual had been rehearsing for years, without either of them knowing it would be needed this badly. Marcus did not panic. He did not order an immediate slaughter of everyone connected to Cassius, which is precisely what most men in his position would have done and what most men in his position had done before him. According to Cassius Dio, Marcus was saddened by the betrayal far more than he was enraged by it. He is said to have told his men that he hoped to capture Cassius alive, not to execute him, but to look him in the eye, ask him why, and then forgive him, to prove that a Roman emperor could survive an act of treason without becoming as cruel as the traitor who committed it. This is not a story about a man with no temper to lose. This is not a story about a man who didn't feel the sting of that particular betrayal. This is a story about a man who had spent years rehearsing exactly this kind of morning, so that when it finally came, his first instinct was not vengeance. It was restraint. He never got his conversation with Cassius. Before Marcus could reach him, Cassius's own officers turned on him, killed him, and sent his head back to the camp as a kind of grim peace offering, the gift they assumed the emperor wanted. Marcus did not want it. He refused to look at it. He ordered it buried, not displayed, and by most accounts, he mourned the fact that a resolution he actually wanted, a real conversation, an actual reckoning, maybe even a version of reconciliation, had been taken from him by other people's violence before he ever got the chance. Think about how strange that is. The emperor, mourning the death of the man who tried to steal his throne. Not because he approved of what Cassius did. Because he had rehearsed, that whole time, a version of justice that did not require cruelty to feel complete, and other people's panic denied him the chance to prove it. This is the moment the open loop finally closes. Remember the tent on the frozen riverbank, the quiet rehearsal before dawn, the promise that this habit would be tested against someone Marcus had trusted with his own army? This was that morning. Not a single morning, really, but hundreds of mornings before it, each one preparing him just enough that when the real betrayal arrived, he had already decided, long before it happened, exactly who he intended to be on the other side of it. You do a smaller version of this more often than you realize. The conversation you rehearse in the shower before you have it for real. The hard phone call you run through in your head on the drive over, so you don't fall apart when you're actually on the line. That is premeditatio malorum, still alive, still working, 2,000 years later, in a car, in a bathroom, in the 5 minutes before something difficult begins. Marcus simply did it on the scale of an empire. So here is what all of this actually comes down to. Marcus Aurelius was not calm because nothing bad ever happened to him. Plague swept through his empire. War took years he never got back. A man he trusted with his own army tried to steal his throne while he was still recovering from illness. Nothing about his life was gentle. He was calm because he had rehearsed, every single morning, exactly how he intended to respond before the world gave him a reason to respond at all. That's the first thing worth taking with you. Premeditatio malorum was never about assuming the worst in people so you could resent them in advance. It was about deciding, ahead of time, in a quiet moment nobody else could see, who you were going to be when the hard moment finally arrived. Here's the second thing, and it's more personal than the first. You cannot control who you're going to meet today. You cannot control who lies to you, who disappoints you, who turns out to be less loyal than you believed. Marcus couldn't control that either, not as a young man learning from Rusticus, not as an emperor watching his own general declare himself ruler. What you can control is whether you walk into your day already decided, or whether you leave that decision to be made in a panic, in the moment, by whichever version of you happens to show up when you're caught off guard. And here's the last thing, the part one think about the most. The peace people admired in Marcus Aurelius was never given to him. It was not a personality trait he got lucky with. It was built, in the dark, alone, morning after morning, for years, long before anyone needed to see the results. By the time the real betrayal came, on that frozen frontier, in the worst year of his reign, he had already done the hardest part. He had already decided who he was going to be. So here's my question for you, and I actually want to know the answer. If you rehearse tomorrow morning the way Marcus rehearsed his, if you sat, just for a few minutes, and quietly decided who you were going to be before anyone had the chance to disappoint you, what is one thing you'd want to already have decided? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this changed how you think about that quote you've probably seen 100 times without understanding where it came from, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Because 2,000 years from now, someone might still be reading what you decided to become on an ordinary, difficult morning. Marcus never knew we'd be watching. He rehearsed anyway.